All right. Well, just a quick disclaimer. Normally, I have a chance to rehearse the sermon a few times before Sunday. That hasn't happened this week. So this could be a 20-minute sermon. It could be 45 minutes. Just hang on. I have no clue how long this is going to last. I'll do my best to keep us on time. But with that being said, we're going to dive in. So whenever I do premarital counselings, one of my favorite parts of the process is talking about expectations. Because conflict is generally the result of unmet expectations. And so, for instance, when Lucy and I got married, we never talked about how many kids we would want. And so we make sure, how many kids are you guys expecting to have? What's the spacing of those kids going to look like? We talk about what type of house do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a neighborhood? Do you want to live in the country? Do you want to live in an old house with a lot of character? Do you want to have a new build where you're like, things aren't going to go wrong, and then things still go wrong? And but we talk about 1,000 things. Who's going to mow the yard? Who's going to do the dishes? Who's going to discipline kids? How are you guys going to split up holidays? Like, does your family get Thanksgiving and your family get Christmas? Are you going to flip-flop it? What are you guys going to do with family dynamics? We talk about all of that stuff to make sure we try to get expectations out on the table. Well, when it comes to our faith, things are no different. If we have the wrong expectations when it comes to our relationship with God, we're setting ourselves up to have kind of a conflict, a headbutting, so to speak. And I believe one of the greatest lies that our culture has bought into, that maybe we unknowingly sell to people at times, is if you follow Christ, then you will have health, wealth, and prosperity. Like your life is falling apart, it's a wreck. But if you choose Jesus, everything will go better. Everything will go well. And we buy into that. And if that's our expectation, what happens when life falls apart? If our expectation is, if I have Christ, nothing goes wrong, what happens when you suffer abuse or loss or disappointment? What happens when someone you love, you lose them? What happens when life isn't going well? And if that's your expectation that it should be perfect, when life falls apart, you can find yourself feeling like maybe Jesus bait and switched you. You can find yourself even getting angry at God and questioning his goodness and questioning his character. But the truth is Jesus never did a bait and switch. In fact, if you read John 15, he tells followers, he says, if you follow me, the world is going to hate you. Right? Jesus never paints a picture of gumdrops and lemon drops falling from the sky. In fact, he's very honest. And so Revelation chapter 6 is going to help set the stage for us to have proper expectations for what it looks like to faithfully follow Christ in a fallen world. So if we are going to be faithful in our following Christ in a world that stands in opposition to him, or in a world that's fallen and broken because of sin, we need to understand what the proper expectations are for what that will be like. And Revelation 6 does such a good job of helping us understand that, okay? So we're going to break this text down into 3 parts. The first part is verses 1 through 8, and that's going to be the 4 horsemen. So let's jump in. He says, now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals. All right, so real quick, last week we talked about there being the scroll in heaven, no one being worthy to open it until Jesus shows up on the scene. Now Jesus is beginning to open the scroll, and as the scroll is opened, we see what it contains. All right, so the Lamb is Jesus, and he's beginning to open this scroll or to reveal the will of God. All right, so now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. Right? So in verses 1 through 8, there will be 4 horsemen, 4 horses with riders on them. Right? Real quick, the horsemen are symbolic. Right? They're not literal horsemen like riding around the sky. Right? The horsemen are symbolic of things that cause human suffering. Right? So these 4 horsemen are going to be symbolic of things that cause humans to suffer. Now the number 4 is also symbolic. It means all-encompassing. It's like north, south, east, west. Like that's all directions. It's like the 4 creatures from chapter 4 are symbolic of all of creation. So these 4 horsemen are all-encompassing of the primary things that cause human suffering in a fallen world. All right, so the first horse is the white horse. And as you look at it, at first, you're thinking this looks a lot like Jesus. I mean, it's a white horse. Revelation 19, Jesus comes on a white horse. This person, the rider, is given a crown. Jesus has a crown. This rider has a bow. And so at first glance, it's like, is this horse Jesus? But the four horsemen are a team, right? They are a collective whole. And so you don't have one good horse and then three bad horses, right? Like, this is not Jesus. It looks like Jesus, but at the end of the day, it's just an imitation. So if this is something that looks like Jesus, but is only imitating him, what this is actually a picture of the Antichrist, okay? So the white horse is the Antichrist. Now, when I say Antichrist, we have to understand that in Scripture, the Antichrist is primarily talked about in three ways. You have a capital A Antichrist, which we'll get to in the book of Revelation. That is a singular person who will show up before the return of Christ. We also have lowercase antichrists. So a lot of lowercase antichrist. A lowercase antichrist is an antichrist type, right? A lowercase antichrist is someone who is power hungry, self-glorifying, a warmonger who wants to rule the world, right? And then you have the spirit of the Antichrist. And so what in the world is the spirit of the Antichrist? Well, the spirit of the Antichrist is it's satanic activity. It's demonic activity that is always working behind the scenes to pull people's hearts away from God, right? So there's always this spirit of the Antichrist at work behind the scenes seeking to pull us away from Jesus, right? And so when we look at the white horsemen here, I don't believe this is the capital A Antichrist. I think it's symbolic of both Antichrist types, lowercase antichrists, and the spirit of the Antichrist. And so the lowercase Antichrist displays itself in that word conquer, right? So you'll see in verse 2, it says, he came out conquering and to conquer, which means he came to make war, right? And so this war is both physical war and spiritual warfare. Right? So the lowercase antichrists, all right, those people who I defined as power-hungry, self-glorifying warmongers who want to rule the world, those are lowercase antichrists who cause physical war in the world that we're in. Right? And so these are people who are going to war, trying to conquer the world. That would be your Stalins, your Hitlers. You could make a case for the Kim dynasty. But these types of people have existed throughout all of history, and they're doing so as a type of Antichrist. But this white horse also represents spiritual warfare, right? So spiritual warfare is that spirit of the Antichrist. And so the way the spirit of the Antichrist works is it provides attractive things. Like this white horse is an attractive horse. It's white. It's got a crown, right? It takes attractive things that try to lure us away from Jesus. Or it takes attractive things and tries to distract us and to pull us away from the heart of God. And I believe the way that the Antichrist spirit works, it's primarily through sin, but it also comes through bad theology, all right? So the way it works with sin, as sin is presented to us as something that's attractive. And sin becomes something that we think, well, maybe I can manage this. Maybe I can just keep it at an arm's length, keep it kind of close where I can experience what I want to experience from it, but I can keep it far enough away that it'll never destroy me. And so many Christians do this. You have these sins in your life that you treat like you can cozy up next to and control, but at the end of the day, we have to understand that sin's desire is to kill and to destroy you. Right? So sin might start out as something cuddly and cute, but at the end of the day, it will grow and it will ultimately destroy your life. And so sin, with the spirit of the Antichrist, works to reshape your heart. And when I say your heart, I'm talking about the way you think, the way you feel, and the way that you act. And so if you cozy up to sin long enough, it will reshape the way that you think about Jesus. It will reshape the way you think about sin. It'll reshape the way you feel. All of a sudden, things that used to break your heart, or things that you used to feel you should avoid, become things that you think are okay, and it will reshape the way that you act. You'll begin to live differently. And so sin, with the spirit of the Antichrist, will reshape your heart to pull you away from Jesus. right? In another way, the spirit of the Antichrist works, we looked at this all throughout last spring in the book of 1 John. It's this spirit where we create Jesus to be who we want him to be instead of who he's revealed himself to be, right? And so when all of a sudden, when Jesus becomes this person that just looks like a better version of you, who would never call sin sin, or who would be okay with all these lifestyles that are opposed to him, you're like, well, that's what my Jesus would do. You've fabricated Jesus to be someone who he's not, and you're worshiping an imitation. And an imitation Jesus, or a Jesus that just fits who you want him to be instead of who he's revealed himself to be through his word, is a Jesus that is powerless to save you, right? And so you will see tons of imitation Jesuses presented to Christians and to non-Christians for the purpose of keeping their heart far from God. So we have to understand as we're reading Revelation is that these things, right, these spiritual wars and these physical wars are always existing in an effort to pull the Christian's heart away from God and to keep non-Christians from ever knowing him. All right, so the first horse we see is the white horse, which is the Antichrist. The second horse, verse 3, when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted, take note of that word permitted. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. All right, the red horse is red because it's covered in blood. This horse is symbolic of war, right? And so when we think about war, we have to understand war is constantly taking place. Like the war is always happening. I kid you not, there's a website called the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. You're not going to remember that, all right? Like, write it down. Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. But what this does is it shows not just in the Western world, but in the global world, what's happening as far as warfare goes on a weekly basis. So if you go to that website and look at like how many wars are happening in this moment, it will tell you. So the week before the Israel stuff started unfolding, so before the world went crazy, a week before Israel, this website showed that there were 707 battles currently happening and that there were over 1,000 explosions and remote violences for the purpose of destruction. Like that's happening in the week before Israel unfolded on the global level. So war is always happening. But when it comes to our presence in America, in our church, as Christians here, are we always affected by those wars? Well, the answer is no. We're not affected by every war, but we are affected what's behind every war, right? And behind every war is that which takes away peace, which I would say is anger, right? And so the red horse, the activity it has had in our culture is that it has begun to normalize anger within our world, where it's become normal to be an angry parent, where it's become normal to be an angry football fan, where it's became normal to be an angry driver down the highway, where it's normal to be an angry spouse. And all of a sudden, when anger has become normalized, we don't experience the peace that God has given us. And that red horse, whether it's war or not, is still affecting our lives. And so you see this red horse, which is affecting us and causing us to suffer, right? That word slay means to destroy. And so anger is constantly hurting us. It's constantly hurting the people that we're around, the people that we love. Anger is constantly destroying the people and places that we're around. All right, so we have the Antichrist horse, the war horse. Then look at verses 5 and 6. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius," or a day's wage, "and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do no harm the oil and wine!" Exclamation point, right? So the black horse is symbolic of famine, right? Now this is both physical famine and spiritual famine, right? So physically, you see the scales and the rationing. And if you do the math and you're like, okay, what did wheat cost back in 90 AD? What did barley cost back in the day? What you'll see with these numbers is that food at this point is costing 8 to 16 times higher than their normal cost. And some of you are like, have you seen my grocery bill? Like, the end times is here? Like, you've been to Kroger recently? Sounds like it, right? But what it's showing, it's not 8 times higher. Like, I get it. Like, I'm paying more for my Zone Perfect bars than I want to pay, but they're not 8 times higher yet, right? But the physical famine here is that food costs are 8 to 16 times higher, while things like wine and oil, which are luxuries, are being protected. And so the way that we see physical famine work itself out in our world is that there are poor people who struggle to have their basic needs, while wealthy people would rather protect their luxuries than lend a helping hand. And what we're seeing here is like these things there's always physical famine affecting the poor as the poor struggle to have their basic needs met, while people who have the means to help meet those needs choose to ignore and to protect what they have. Right? So there's physical famine, but then there's also spiritual famine. And spiritually speaking, we hunger for spiritual life, but what happens is we're kept from what we need, right, by being distracted with an abundance of what we don't need. Right? So we have like the wheat and the barley is a spiritual for what we need, while the oil and the wine is what we don't need. And so spiritually we experience famine when that spiritual hunger we have, we're kept from having it satisfied by being distracted with an abundance of what we don't need while not having what we truly need. And so what do we need? Like for our spiritual hunger, we need a relationship with Jesus. We need more time with God. We need true, authentic Christian community where we are surrounded by other Christians who will love us and care for us and push us in our relationship to be closer to Christ. Like we need those things. But what distracts us? Instead of going for the things that we need, we become distracted by an abundance of what we don't need, which is often bigger houses, nicer cars, fancier clothes, more extravagant vacations. And so we get so caught up in the pursuit of those things that we lose sight of our time with Jesus, our time in true Christian community. And what happens is we experience spiritual famine. And so the black horse rides, causing famine. And then the fourth horse, verses 7 and 8. He says, when he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, come. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse. And its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword and with famine, with pestilence, and by wild beasts on the earth. All right, so the fourth horse is the horse of death. So this horse comes out looking like the Grim Reaper. It's got a black hood on it, the sickle, is that what it's called? Like the thing, right? And you're like, Jeff, I'm going to tell you that's not right. What's it called? It is a sickle. All right, so the sickle, it looks like, you ever watch wrestling as a kid? It looks like the Undertaker. Right? Like it looks like the Undertaker with the Grim Reaper. All right. So you have or the pallbearer. So you have this pale, deathly looking horse, and behind it comes Hades, which is a picture of hell. And so I said, like, these four horses are a team, right? And these four horses are causing spiritual death, right? Spiritual death is what separates us from God. So all have sinned, and the penalty of sin is death, right? Death. Death is this spiritual separation from God, from a right relationship with Him. But what we see is this horse is representative of not just spiritual death, but also physical death. And what follows physical death is eternity. And so I want to tell you something that is offensive in our culture to say, but it needs to be said, and it's actually the most loving thing I can say. All right? If you physically die while being spiritually dead, like if you are spiritually dead, separated from God, not in a right relationship with Him, and you physically die, you will spend all eternity separated from God's grace and love and in the eternal presence of His justice and wrath. And like I understand people are like, you can't say that. Are you gaslighting me? I'm not. Like the most evil thing I could say is be like, you're good to go. You're good to go. But the truth is we are spiritually dead because of our sin. Right? And if we die in that spiritual condition physically, we will spend eternity not in the presence of God's grace and love, but in the presence of His justice and wrath. That is the bad news that Jesus came to bring good news in response to. Right? And so when you look at that, I would say that's not unkind to say, it's loving to say, and we'll come back to that, all right? Another thing I want to point out with this fourth horse is that it says that a fourth of the earth. Jesus has given authority, and that phrase given is a lot like the word permitted in verse 4. He has given authority over a fourth of the earth. The fourth here is not literal, but symbolic. It's not like only a fourth of the people in the world suffer from these four horses. No. Like we all suffer from these horses. The fourth here is symbolic that these horsemen don't have unlimited reign. They're restricted to do only what God allows them to do. Right? So these horses, they do not have unlimited reign as they ride. At the end of the day, they are restricted to only do what God will allow them to do. Now that raises a very big theological question. If God is allowing suffering, right? If suffering happens and God allows it to happen, why would he allow his followers to face it? Why would he allow his followers to suffer it? Why would he allow his followers to go through suffering? Like if God is in control and he's allowing it to happen, why? Like why would he let his people go through this? And so we're going to come back to that theological question in the application. All right, verses 9 through 11. All right, this is the second. The first part are the four horsemen. The second part is the response of the saints. So how do Christians respond to this news of these four horsemen? He says, when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. All right, so this could be either literal martyrs, people who have died for their faith, or it could be symbolic of all Christians who are suffering at the hands of these horsemen. It could be both, right? They cried out, verse 10, they cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who will dwell on the earth? And so the question they ask is, how long will we suffer the effects of these four horsemen riding through the world? How long are we going to go through this type of stuff? And here's what he says in verse 11. Then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been killed. All right, and so the response is like, how long is this going to last? And what we hear is a little longer. And so the question is like, well, how long is that? Have you ever road tripped with kids before? Like, if you road trip with a kid, like, are we there yet? Are we there? I found it's most effective for kids not to communicate in time, but to communicate in episodes of TV shows they watch. Like, how are we there yet? 7 blueies. 7 blueies, right? Like, if you want to calculate it out, like, it's 9 blueies to get from here to Asheville. It's 38 blueies to get from here to Atlanta, right? So you can communicate in blueies because they can make sense of that. Like Bentley, 7 blueies, that's forever, right? But when it comes to time, like on a road trip, it's really relative to the person and how much you travel. So if we're driving as a family, the Martin family jumps into a van and we drive from here to my parents' house in Texas, right? Like when we cross the border into the nation of Texas, right? Like, our kids like, are we there yet? I'm like, close. Right now, close in Texas, like for my kids, close is Kingsport to Johnson City. They're like, all right, how many blues is that? Right? But for me, I'm like, we're close. In Texas, that's hours, right? Like you're in the state of Texas and you have just as much time to go, but you're at least in the nation up. So all that to say, like, time is relative. And so when Jesus says a little longer, you know, for God, what to us could be 1,000 years, to him could be a day. And what to us could be a day, could to him be 1,000 years. And so the question is like, well, how much longer is a little longer? Like, how long is that? And verses 12 through 17 help us to answer that question. It says, when he opened the 6th seal, I looked and behold, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth, and the full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth, and the fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand?" In verses 12 through 17, we answer the question of how long is a little longer with, this is a picture of the end of time. Right? This is a picture of the end of time that we're getting in verses 12 through 17. And so when we ask the question, well, how long is a little while longer? Well, it's the end of history. Or as John would say, the day of God's great wrath towards sin. Right? So what we're seeing in chapter 6 is that Christians will suffer from Satan's activity in this world until Jesus returns. Sweet. Right? Like that's the answer. Like, we have to understand as we're reading Revelation that as followers of Christ, as we seek to faithfully follow Jesus in a world that stands in opposition to him, we will suffer from Satan's activity until the day he returns. Right? That's hard news to swallow. It's like, how much longer until Jesus comes back? All right, and so what do we do with this? What's the big takeaway? Well, what we have to understand is that these horses, right, are symbolic of a war that's raging. Like both in the spiritual realm, and the physical realm, there is a war waging. And for us, if there is a war happening, we have to understand that we will have to fight to faithfully follow Christ in a fallen world, right? As Christians, we have to understand, like when it comes to expectations, like what should we expect as Christians? We should expect that we will have to fight to live faithfully for Christ in this fallen world. All right, so think about back to the marriage illustration. If I have a couple that's about to get married, and I'm setting expectations for them, and I go, you guys, this is the hardest part. Make it through the wedding, and you're smooth sailing from here on out. Like, would that be good? Like, they're like, whoo, because the engagement has been a bear. Like, you're telling me after I say I do, we're good to go. We got this. That's not good expectations. Here's the real expectation. When the wedding ends, the war begins. So go to Bed Bath & Beyond, register for a helmet and a cup because the battle's coming, right? Like, that's the truth. Like, you're like, what, Jeff? Think about it. Like, all right. Think about this. In the Garden of Eden, when does Satan show up? Before or after the wedding? After. Because if he can destroy an individual, he can destroy an individual. But if he can destroy a marriage, he can destroy a family. And if he can destroy a family, he can destroy generations. So the battle begins after the marriage. Like, all right, so we need to set that expectation. In the same sense, we have to understand that we are in a battle. We are in a battle, and Satan wants nothing more than to pull our hearts away from God. And so for us to keep our hearts near, we have to fight to remain faithful to him. All right, and so then we have the question of like, okay, like, why does God allow this to happen? Like, why would God, why doesn't God just take us out of this? Or why doesn't God protect us? Why does God allow us to suffer in this world? And I'm going to oversimplify this, but these horses that we read about are actually present in the Old Testament. Read Ezekiel 14. So these four horsemen are nothing new, right? These four horsemen are always against God's people. And so as they come, like think about common grace. Common grace is the fact that both good people and evil people benefit from the rain and the sun, right? In the same way, both good people and evil people suffer the consequences of these horses riding around the earth, all right? And so in Ezekiel 14, what we see is there's a twofold purpose with God, right? Because Revelation 6 shows us that Jesus is in control. He's in control of everything, even our suffering. And if he's in control of our suffering, that means our suffering cannot be aimless or without purpose. And the two purposes to the suffering in Ezekiel 14, which I believe to be true of Revelation 6, is the purpose is judgment for those who reject God and refinement for those who are faithfully following him. Right? So for those who reject God, the suffering they go through is judgment. And I would say that on earth, before physical death, To experience that is actually a means of God's grace. He's giving you a taste of what you fully deserve. Like the wrath of God that we experience now is a taste of the fullness of what we truly deserve for rejecting him and rebelling against him with our sin. And so God giving us a taste now in such a way that we could then turn to repent and pursue Christ and to be saved from it is actually God's kindness, right? But this is just a taste of a greater judgment to come, right? The great day of God's wrath. But for the Christian, as we live in this, we have to understand God uses it for the purpose of refinement or to shape us to be more and more like his son, Jesus Christ, right? And so for me, this has been really good for me to sit in this week because if I walked you through the last 3 weeks of my life before this last week, there's a lot of stuff that piled up on top of each other. I sat with a friend on Thursday and I was like, this is what all's happened. He's like, whew, right? And so for me coming out of that, I needed Revelation 6. Because for me, the reminder is if God has a purpose for the stuff we go through, even when it's hard, my response as a Christian doesn't need to be, God, get me out. It needs to be, God, get me through, right? So when you go through hard times, at the effects of these four horsemen who are constantly riding, let the Christian response not be, God, help me to escape this, but God, give me the strength to make it through. Give me the wisdom to see what you're doing in and through this trial in the way that you are shaping me to be more like Christ. All right? So in conclusion, I think back to my junior year of high school. My junior year of high school, I had a Sunday school teacher named Jeff McIntosh. And Jeff, he sat down with me and said, hey, I went to college. He goes, my first semester, I had a 3.75. And he goes, I put the same effort in the next semester, my sophomore year and going into my junior year, and he goes, and I don't have a college degree. He goes, college only gets harder. And I needed to hear that. Like that sat with me for the rest of my junior year into my senior year and going into college with the expectation that my freshman year, it's only going to get harder. And so for us, if we think that we can just coast through our Christian life, right, and make it through, we're fooling ourselves. If we just coast through life, our hearts will ultimately pull away from Jesus. Our hearts will feel distant from him, all right? So what we need to have the expectation of is that the Christian life is a life where we have to fight for faithfulness, especially in the light of this being a fallen world. All right, so here's the good news, though, all right? And I want to be 110% clear on this, all right? The good news is that our salvation is not based on our effort. Our salvation is not based on our faithfulness towards God, but his faithfulness towards us. So we don't have to work to stay saved, but we do work to experience the goodness of that salvation and what it means and the benefits of it in this world. So will the Christian life be easy? No. Will it be worth it? Absolutely. So let's keep our focus on Jesus. Let's find our hope in him in the good times and in the worst of times and know that Jesus is working and he rules and he reigns. God, thank you for your word. As we as a church live in a world that has the effects of these four horsemen, the effects of the Antichrist who wants to pull our hearts away from you, the effects of spiritual famine where we're distracted from you with an abundance of things we don't need. God, the effects of anger becoming normalized in our hearts, the effects of death, and God, the reality of eternity. God, help us to work to be faithful, not to earn your love, but to live from your love. God, we need you. And so, God, let us have a confidence knowing that you're in control. Let us have a confidence that comes from knowing you're good. And God, help us and give us the strength to remain faithful to you until we meet you face to face. God, it's in your holy name we pray. Amen.